We have a climate crisis, a precarious international agreement that could crumble at any moment, and a new US administration that seems hell-bent on making life less safe and less affordable for millions of Americans. Is there any good news? There is, my friends, if you look hard enough, that is. Hey everyone, and welcome to the show. I'm Laura McLeod, and you're listening to the For Climate Out Loud podcast, where we cover the latest news from the world of environmental politics. This first episode will be a state of the climate of sorts. I'll be talking about where we're at with climate change and the Paris Agreement before going over some of the things that have been happening in the US since President Trump took office. This will be one of the main things we'll be covering on this podcast, and I'll be providing you with a lot more information and detail on this as we move forward. But to start with, I wanted to make sure we're all up to speed on the basics and on what's been going on. So before I begin, make sure to follow For Climate Out Loud on social media and hit subscribe so you can stay updated on the latest episodes. Thank you so much for listening, and let's jump right in. 2024 was the hottest year on record. In fact, between June 2023 and September 2024, so for 16 months straight, the world's average temperatures smashed all previous records. Last year was also the first year in which average global surface temperatures exceeded 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. Now let's pause here for a moment to talk about this threshold and why it matters. According to the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, to prevent the most severe impacts of climate change and ensure a habitable planet, it is imperative that we limit global warming as much as possible and as quickly as possible. This is why in 2015, 196 countries came together to sign a legally binding international treaty on climate change, the Paris Agreement, which I'll be talking about more in just a moment. Under this agreement, nations have committed to significantly reducing global greenhouse gas emissions in an effort to maintain the long-term global average surface temperature increase well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, with additional efforts to limit the rise to 1.5 degrees. Now, occasionally exceeding that 1.5 degree benchmark doesn't necessarily mean we've missed the Paris Agreement's goal. We have to look at long-term changes over decades, not individual months or years, because temperatures can jump around due to natural variations like El Niño and La Niña or volcanic eruptions, so we look at the long-term trends. Breaching that 1.5 degrees for a month, a few months, as was the case during the last 2 years, now that's a wake-up call. That means we're getting close to exceeding the long-term limit. And what it also means is that we need to up our game and take faster action to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and prevent irreversible damage. Now, what do we mean by irreversible damage? We mean more and more frequent and dangerous extreme weather events, including heat waves, droughts, wildfires, heavy rain, and flooding. Exceeding 1.5 degrees could also potentially trigger the collapse of major ocean circulation systems, a sudden and rapid thawing of boreal permafrost, and the destruction of tropical coral reef systems, all of which would have detrimental, irreversible impacts on the climate and on humanity. Even at current levels of global warming, some of these climate impacts are already observable. Antarctic and Arctic sea ice extent in 2024 have both been well below average. Meanwhile, glaciers around the world are melting at a staggering pace. According to the World Glacier Monitoring Service, in 2023, glaciers lost a record 1.2 meter water equivalent of ice. That's approximately 5 times as much water as there is in the Dead Sea. In Switzerland, where I grew up, glaciers lost about 10% of their remaining volume in just 2 years. Add to this the fact that ocean heat content in 2023 was the highest on record, a trend that seems to have continued last year, and what you get is rising sea levels. The expansion of water due to heating, combined with the melting of glaciers and ice sheets, has resulted in the doubling of the long-term rate of sea level rise since the beginning of the satellite record. This is critical. According to the UN Atlas of the Oceans, 8 of the world's 10 largest cities are near a coast. These coastal urban areas already face significant threats to infrastructure from rising sea levels. Roads, bridges, subways, water supplies, oil and gas wells, power plants, sewage treatment plants, and landfills are all at risk. Higher background water levels also mean more deadly and destructive storm surges, which will reach further and further inland. Also, rising sea levels will cause more frequent high tide flooding or nuisance flooding, which, while not deadly, can be disruptive and costly. Finally, rising sea levels and the saltwater intrusion that comes with that can damage coastal ecosystems, which in turn will have impacts on recreational activities, storm protection, fish and wildlife habitats, and freshwater supplies. But again, rising sea levels and storms are not the only consequence of global warming. Many regions of the world have had below average rainfall, causing droughts, wildfires, and water shortages. Meanwhile, other regions have had higher than normal rainfall, causing significant flooding. The rising intensity of adverse weather due to climate change is becoming more dangerous both to human health and to ecosystems. Now, climate change deniers will argue that global warming is unnatural, a normal variation seen at various other points in history. But while it's true that high levels of naturally released carbon dioxide have caused fluctuations in climate in the past, what we're seeing today is far different than anything we've seen or studied from the past. Our current climate is changing significantly faster than at any other point in history. The cause? Human activity. The facts are undeniable. Humans today are emitting greenhouse gases at a far higher rate than any previous increase in history. The accumulation of these gases in our atmosphere contributes to the greenhouse gas effect, which in turn leads to heat becoming trapped on Earth and global temperatures to rise. So given what we know, which is that the climate is changing at an unprecedented rate, this change is primarily caused by human activity, and the devastating consequences of climate change will increasingly lead to political, economic, and social instability. The question that begs asking is, what are we doing about it? As I mentioned before, the most prominent response to the climate crisis has come in the form of the Paris Agreement, a legally binding international treaty on climate change adopted by 196 countries at the UN Climate Conference in Paris in December of 2015. The primary objective of the agreement is to keep, quote, the increase in the global average temperature to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels, end quote, and to make efforts to limit the temperature increase to 1.5 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. To achieve this target, greenhouse gas emissions would have to reach their peak before 2025 and decrease by 43% by 2030. The agreement entails a commitment by major emitting countries to reduce climate pollution and enhance those efforts over time. It also establishes a framework for wealthier countries to provide financial, technical, and capacity building support to developing countries, as well as a transparency framework aimed at monitoring, reporting, and increasing countries' climate goals. Now, the good news is that since the agreement came into force, there have been significant developments in renewable technologies and growth in the low-carbon economy. An increasing number of countries and corporations are setting carbon neutrality targets, and zero-carbon solutions are emerging as competitive alternatives across various economic sectors that currently account for 25% of emissions, creating profitable business opportunities. The bad news is, it's not enough. As I mentioned earlier, it looks like we're already well on track to breaching the 1.5 degrees benchmark set by the Paris Agreement. According to the UN, we're still on track for 2.6 to 2.8 warming by 2100. And if all net zero pledges were achieved, this number could drop to 1.9, but this can only happen if countries take more decisive action. In December of 2023, the signatory countries met in Dubai and agreed for the first time on the need to transition away from fossil fuels, although they did not formally commit to any specific action. So naturally, a year later, when they met again, they had little to show for as far as actual progress towards this goal is concerned. So why can't they get it together? Well, it's complicated. For starters, developing countries argue that the $300 billion a year in climate finance they'll receive by 2035 from rich countries is much too little. To be fair, it's better than the $100 billion a year they're currently getting, but some rightfully argue that if we want to significantly curb rising temperatures, then wealthy nations need to do more to help emerging economies cut their emissions, given that they're responsible for 75% of growth in emissions over the past decade. Another problem is that countries that rely on oil and gas exports don't seem to be seriously committed to the effort of reducing emissions. At the last meeting, the president of Azerbaijan went as far as to say that oil and gas are gifts from God and that his country would expand gas production by up to a third over the next 10 years. And then there's the US under President Trump. His decision to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement on the basis that it's unfair, one-sided, and a ripoff leaves a major vacuum that other countries now have to scramble to fill. One country that's poised to take on a much bigger role in filling that gap is China. While China is currently the largest emitter of greenhouse gases, it also is ahead of everyone else in the race for renewables. Still considered a developing country, China has no formal obligation to reduce its greenhouse gas emissions or provide aid to poorer countries. But despite this, China has voluntarily agreed to have its contributions go towards aiding climate-vulnerable countries, a smart move that is very much in line with its overall strategy of providing aid in developing countries in order to broaden its influence around the world. So for all his talk about going head-to-head with China, Trump's decision to withdraw the US from the Paris Agreement has given China a major advantage, all the while weakening the United States' competitiveness in the clean energy market and undermining its leadership around the world, not to mention the devastating impacts this will have on the environment and on people's lives. It's what you call self-sabotage on a massive scale. Speaking of which, let's talk about what's going on domestically in the US under the new Trump administration. As I said before, I'll be talking a lot more about this over the course of the show, but for now, let's recap some of the main things that have happened since President Trump took office, starting with federal funding. Under the Biden administration's 2022 Inflation Reduction Act, the Environmental Protection Agency was authorized to create and implement the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, a $27 billion investment to fight the climate crisis by mobilizing financing and private capital to fund projects across the country that are focused on reducing greenhouse gas and air pollution. The Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund's goal was to finance clean technology deployment nationally, including in low-income and disadvantaged communities, while simultaneously building the capacity of community lenders that serve those communities and spur the adoption of clean energy to lower the bills for millions of Americans. But shortly after taking office, President Trump froze those billions in dollars in spending, and Lee Zeldin, the current head of the EPA, moved to terminate the grant program altogether. Just to give you an example, among the programs that were paused is the Clean School Bus Program, which helps schools buy electric buses as a way to reduce emissions and bringing cleaner air to students across the country. Interestingly, what wasn't affected was a big project in Montana backed by Republican Senator Steve Daines. This particular project has been given approval to move forward. Don't get me wrong, this is a good program. It provides a company named Montana Renewables with a $1.67 billion loan to expand its plant in Great Falls, where they convert vegetable oils and fats into diesel and jet fuels. The project, like most other projects supported by the Greenhouse Gas Reduction Fund, provides high-paying jobs and boosts the economy while reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's great, and it should move forward. But so should all the other projects, not just Republican-backed ones. Trump's order to freeze climate spending has since been blocked by multiple federal judges. The last order came from U.S. District Judge Tanya Chutkan, preventing the EPA from ending the Green Bank grant program and blocking Citibank, which currently holds the money on behalf of the EPA, from transferring it to the government. In the meantime, though, grant recipients and contractors have no access to the money they were promised, and their programs are still on hold. Let's move on to the firing of federal workers. It's no news to anyone at this point that the Trump administration has been gutting the federal workforce across a wide range of departments, including USAID and the Consumer Financial Protection Bureau. Both these agencies were involved in working on climate and environmental issues. Last week, Lisa Friedman, reporting for the New York Times, found that the EPA is planning to eliminate its scientific research arm, firing over 1,000 scientists working on safeguarding human health and ecosystems from environmental pollutants. Over 1,000 scientists. That's about 75% of the program staff. And then there's President Trump's obsession with drilling and mining. Trump claims that we are in what he calls an energy emergency that has driven up consumer costs. This is nonsense. The US produces more crude oil than any other country in the world, and the average price of oil has barely changed over the last 20 years, adjusted for inflation. So why is it that Trump is so obsessed with gas? Well, one obvious reason is that oil and gas executives have donated millions to his campaign, hoping to increase the already record-high production of fuel. The problem for Trump at this point is that the tariffs he's imposed on steel, aluminum, and crude imports, among other things, are quickly going to drive up costs for the very same oil and gas companies who supported him. So to recap, we have a climate crisis, a precarious international agreement that could crumble at any moment, and a new U.S. administration that seems hell-bent on making life less safe and less affordable for millions of Americans. Is there any good news? There is, my friends, if you look hard enough, that is. There's the fact that so far the renewable energy sector has been growing steadily, proving its viability both as an answer to the climate crisis and as a motor for economic development. In fact, there are 7 countries that are now powered by 100% clean renewable energy: Albania, Bhutan, Ethiopia, Iceland, Nepal, Paraguay, and the Democratic Republic of Congo. Isn't that cool? Also, governments around the world have been expanding their environmental policies, and there are more and more nonprofits fighting the good fight. But what I find most encouraging is that there's a growing movement of people like you, who just spent the last 20 minutes or so listening to me rant about melting ice caps and rising temperatures. People who are passionate about the environment and eager to make a difference. You are the good news, my friends. And if you want to help me make a difference, then hit those like and subscribe buttons and follow For Climate Out Loud to get your latest news from the world of environmental politics. I'm Laura McLeod, and you've been listening to For Climate Out Loud. Thanks for listening. Until next time.